Hey guys, so I'm going to go ahead and start our second lesson of the week where we're talking about our story having to do with sea turtles, and we've been talking about problem and solution. But before we get into the different story elements and using that problem and solution to help us describe a plot, let's first talk about vocabulary. So with your vocabulary, you guys started making a Freyer model. And if you recall, a Freyer model were these. It had the word in the middle, and then it had the 4 different squares around it. Now, all that I asked for you guys to do on Monday was I asked for you to write the definition, which you could find in your reading book, and also put a picture, right? Now, these last two ones, these last 2 squares on each of them are going to be filled in today. So that's for every one of your vocab words. And again, I believe there are 8. So what you're going to do is on these last 2 boxes, this one over here, you're going to put a synonym of the word and an antonym of the word. Synonym is something that means about the same thing. Antonym means something that would be like the opposite. I told synonyms when I was teaching the vocabulary words. I used synonyms. I said, a word that comes to mind when I think of obsessed is, and then I gave a synonym for that. You can think of these on your own. Or if you are really struggling and you want to use thesaurus.com, if you just look up synonyms of obsessed, I'm sure thesaurus.com would be one of the first things that comes up, and you would just type in words and it would give you synonyms and antonyms. That is an option for you, but you can absolutely try it without that. Also, if you have a dictionary, a lot of the time it has synonyms and antonyms within those definitions. So there's a lot of different options there for you to find synonyms and antonyms. Just make sure whatever you put down, that it makes sense and that you know what it means. If you don't know what it means, don't put it down. Also, if it doesn't have to do with our definition of the word, don't put it down. Make sure that it makes sense with the definition that we have been using. For example, for the word blunt, a common meaning of the word blunt is someone who just tells it like it is. That's not the definition that we're using. The definition that we're using for the word blunt has to do with something being dull. Just gave a synonym. So make sure that whatever synonyms and antonyms you choose go with our definition that we're using this week. So that's what you'll be putting for this box over here. And then for this box over here, you'll just be writing a sentence. Now, you need to make sure that on your sentence, you put context clues, okay? So I'm going to show you an example. First of all, for synonyms and antonyms for the word obsessed, you guys can even copy me on this one if you would like. A synonym would be like adore. Now, it doesn't mean exactly the same thing, but it's very, very close. And then an antonym for obsessed would be like hate. Okay, now for a sentence, I'm not just going to put I am obsessed with dogs. That's the sentence that I used because when I was teaching the lesson, because I further explained it. But I want for people to be able to look at my sentence and look at all the clues around it and decide and be able to decide what obsessed would mean. So like my sentence might be, I think about dogs all the time. My brother says I'm obsessed. See how I put more context clues? And this is actually 2 sentences in one. That's totally fine. I'm going to underline my word here. But I didn't just want to say I'm obsessed with dogs because that doesn't really that wouldn't give anyone anything to look at to help them find the meaning. If I used this, people would be able to say, okay, if she thinks about all dogs all the time, she thinks about it all the time, and she's saying that's the same thing as obsessed, that must be what that means. So make sure that in your sentence you use context clues. So I want for you to do that with all of your vocabulary words for this week. And now let's move on to what we started talking about on Monday with problem and solution. So I read this story to you, If You Take Away the Otter. And we decided that the problem was people were hunting too many sea otters. And then the solution, the thing that fixed that, was new laws were put in place. There was more to the story after the solution, right? And there was stuff in between here that we didn't necessarily write down. We were just like, okay, let's find the problem, let's find the solution. We wrote that down. But there was stuff that happened in between that we could use to help us summarize. And this is a great place to start. It's a great place to think of plot, which is like, the plot would be the actual story, right? Problem and solution is a great way to start out, but it's not everything. Think about any movies that you have watched. Think about any books that you have read. When you first start reading it, think about the most exciting movie, a movie where you have watched it and you are on the edge of your seat. You don't know what's going to happen. It's the same with books. I was like this when I read Harry Potter. There were parts that I didn't know what was going to happen, and I was so excited, and I couldn't stop reading it, right? But when you first start reading that book, or when you first start watching that movie, you're maybe excited for what's to come, but like, you aren't excited right away. They've got to introduce you to the characters first, right? They kind of introduce the characters, and then they introduce a problem, right? They introduce a problem. There's something wrong. In this case, the problem was people were hunting too many sea otters. Before that, we learned about all the other stuff in the ocean, and then boom, problem. And then we heard that, and then whatever problem it mentions, the tension just keeps building. You just keep on getting a little more invested. You get a little more excited. You get a little more excited. And then towards the end of the movie or towards the end of the story, there is this big moment, right? Some would be bigger than others. For this story, we didn't have a moment where we were like, oh my gosh, right? But I can think of many movies like Lion King. When I first watched Lion King, I was on the edge of my seat. And that moment where he goes to fight Scar, I was like, oh my gosh, right? But there's always like a super exciting moment. Not at the end of the movie, but it is towards the end of the movie. A climax does not happen in the middle. It happens very close to the end, right? I said the word climax a little too early, but that exciting part doesn't happen until quite a bit down the road in the movie or in the story. So it takes a while to get there. Once it reaches that exciting part, things kind of start calming down. The author or the people who are making the movie, they've got to kind of tell you, okay, here's how everything started to work out. And then finally at the end, everything is kind of figured out in whatever way the author or the people who wrote the movie, in whatever way they wanted everything to be solved, right? So it's more complex than just there's a problem and a solution. There's what we call like a story mountain. There's that build up, that exciting moment, and then we kind of cool it down a little bit. Think about the emotions that you have when you're reading a story or you're writing or you're watching a movie, right? We can think of it like a mountain. Okay, so let me show you. All right, so I drew this beautiful drawing of myself. I think it's myself. And this part right here, so like if we started the story and I was reading the beginning of the story, we're just kind of like on land right now, right? We're in the grass, we're just kind of walking along. This part is called the beginning. That part is the beginning, just introducing characters. And then to start going on to the mountain, something has to happen. A problem is introduced, right? This part right here, all the way up until there, that is called the rising action, okay? Then I get to the most exciting part during the movie or in the book. This is not in the middle of the story. Right now, mountains look like this. But this exciting part doesn't happen in the middle. It happens towards the end. That part is called the climax. Okay? That's what I mentioned earlier, a little too early, but that part, that most exciting part, when your emotions are at their peak, that is the climax of the story. Then things kind of start calming down. Not everything's fixed yet, but we're getting there. This part is called the falling action. Look at that. We got the rising action. We've got the falling action. And then once all those loose ends are tied and everything's figured out, that very, very last part there is called our resolution. And look, I'm back on dry, I'm back on land. Everything's good. I can go about my life. So stories, narrative stories, not informational stories, but fictional stories, narratives, things that are trying to make us entertained, those could follow what we call a plot diagram. When people write movies, they think of all these different parts. When people write stories, they think of all these different parts. They need all these different parts to craft their story. And we should be thinking of these different parts when we craft our stories as well. Also, it helps us to understand these different parts to better understand what we're reading, right? So what I'm going to have you guys do is if you were here on the last day, you got a paper that looked like this. Okay, if you did not get this, you're just going to write notes. But everyone except for like a couple people who were not here got this thing right here. And this is going to make a flat book. Now, we're not going to use this flat book for a specific story. So you can just kind of, this part right here, you can just kind of cross out. What I want for you to do, though, is I want for you to cut this out into your flat book. So like this part right here will be cut out and cut into your flat book. Now, you have made plenty of flat books in the past, right? You cut that out, and then you cut these flaps here, and then you glue the back of this part in. I'm going to pause the video and do that. Please feel free to go grab that and complete that as well. I'll pause it, and when I come back, everything will be ready to go. So let me pause it real quick. There we go. All right, so this is what mine looks like. I have glued it in. I have these different flaps here. This part's glued. So we're going to take notes on what exactly these different parts of the story are. So the exposition is just a fancy word for the beginning. So I'm going to put a slash here and just write beginning. It's all the same. Exposition, beginning, all the same. But every story has to have it, because if you don't know who the characters and what the setting are, then you don't know, you're not going to be invested when it comes to the climax. So in the exposition or the beginning, the characters and the setting are introduced. The characters in the setting are introduced. Pause if you need to. I'm going to go on to the next one. So again, in this story, when they first were talking about how, you know, there's kelp and there's sea urchins and there's clams and there's sea stars, and then it introduced and there's otters. Still hasn't introduced the problem yet. This does not have the problem in it. It's just introducing the characters. Okay, so that's our beginning or our exposition. The rising action. This is important. At the beginning, so like the problem is introduced. Once the problem is introduced at the start of the rising action, everything after that leading up until the climax is the rising action. So the problem is introduced. It's the majority of the story. It's everything leading up to the climax. It's our mountain is not even, right? The rising action takes up a lot of that space. So in this case, it was everything leading up to that most exciting moment. Now we talked about how in this story, there wasn't like something that was like, oh my gosh, that was so exciting. But we'll talk about how we could identify those different spots. All right, the climax. The climax is, we call it the turning point. Of the story. There's usually some sort of character change, a big character change. It's the usually exciting part right before the solution, directly before the solution. It has to happen in order for that solution to take place. Now, this word exciting, I use very loosely. I was watching Moana the other night, just for kicks, and there were so many parts of it that were exciting. But this part, the climax, is the part that everything's leading up to, and it happens right before the solution. Underline that if you haven't already. All right, so then the falling action. The falling action is the solution is given. It's everything after the climax and right before the resolution. These two things, the falling action and the resolution, they can kind of, merge together a little bit, but the solution is given at the beginning of that falling action. The solution is found. And then the resolution is when all the loose ends are tied. All the loose ends are tied. So, again, in our book, if we had our story mountain here, if we had our story mountain for that, if you take away the otter, the beginning is when they're introducing the characters. The beginning for my story, for my plot diagram of if you take away the otter, would be, in just one sentence, there are kelp, sea urchins, otters, and many other animals in the ocean. Now, what I really should have done before I did that, I should probably have plotted my problem first. We already know what our problem and solution are, right? My problem, remember, in order for the rising action to start, the problem needs to be introduced. Okay, so the problem was people were hunting too many otters. Now, this is also where I would put other notes of things that happened. This is not just the problem. Remember, the problem is what introduces it, but then there's other stuff that happens. So I might say the whole ecosystem became unbalanced. Remember, it kind of talked about how because there weren't otters, then there began to be too many sea urchins. I would put just a few notes of different things that happened here. And then for the climax, now, to find the climax, you need to find the solution. Remember, the falling action is what starts starts with the solution, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write what the solution was over here, and then I'll put exactly what happened right before that. So the falling action, it starts with new laws were put in place. Now, what happened right before that? What happened right before that to start the climax? Well, if I look back at my story here, here was my solution. Remember, this book, there was nothing in here that was like super duper exciting. It's a great book, but that doesn't mean just because it's not super duper exciting, you're on the edge of your seat, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a climax. Here was what started my falling action. They made new laws. But what caused that change? Well, they were worried that otters could disappear forever. So my climax is otters became at risk of becoming extinct. I'm kind of just putting it in my own words here. Otters became at risk of becoming extinct. That is my climax. That is what happened right before my falling action. So then there's a lot of other stuff that happens here after that falling action, after that solution is given. The solution is given here, and then it starts like the otters began to come back. So that's a note that I could put. They ended up protecting those forests as well. So then my resolution is the thing that kind of like ties everything together. There is just enough of everything now. So the ecosystem is fixed. Okay. So we read the story about sea turtles on page 244 of your My Book. And we found the problem and solution. Now, don't forget or don't, throw away what you have about that problem and solution. Remember, we use that problem and solution to help us fill out a story mountain. But you guys have a blank story mountain, a blank plot diagram, right? If you were with us on that last day. And what I want for you to do is I want for you to read that sea turtle story on page 244 of your My Book 2 called On Sea Turtle Patrol. We've already read it, so you don't have to reread it again necessarily unless you need a little refresher. But I want for you to fill in that story diagram, story mountain, plot diagram, all the same thing about that story. I would first, if I were you, I would first start with what the problem is. Remember, that starts the rising action, and what the solution is. That starts the falling action, and fill in the blanks. Okay? We'll be coming together during our group time and talking about what we decided those different parts were. All right. I will see you at our group meeting time.